Okay, this is my third go at a recording. We've had some issues with the quality of it. This is being shared a day plus later than I would have liked, but here we go, and hopefully in a space where I don't have an attacking cat or dog. I'm going to split it up into 2 or 3 links, but we're starting kind of where we ended last Tuesday. We ended with the end of the Korean War and some of the legacies and consequences of that. We talked about the defense pacts that were being formed to contain communism. We already had recently established NATO in Europe. That wasn't a result of the Korean War, but that's going to kind of set a precedent. We don't have a similar one at this point in time in East Asia, but we have established bases in places like Japan. We're going to continue to build and develop our bases in the Philippines. Philippines had their independence at this point in time, but we have an alliance with the Philippines. At this point in time, Taiwan, nationalist China, has relocated. They lost their civil war. So we have, it's not a formal alliance, but we have that relationship there. The U.S. Navy's protecting it. We already talked about the issue there with MacArthur getting in some hot water because he wanted to reestablish nationalist China, ferry the nationalist Chinese back across and continue that war there, and kind of roll back the Chinese communists, continue that war, make the limited war in Korea into more of a general war. By having these kind of defense pacts, when we talk about Vietnam, we established CETO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organizations. We're going to eventually have ANZUS in the South Pacific, the Australia, New Zealand, U.S. Alliance there. So the establishment of these defensive pacts to contain communism, but also really, these are going to be deep alliances that are going to be around for generations, okay? We are going to have a buildup of some conventional forces. When we are on the eve of the Korean War, there were roughly 1.5 million American troops in the U.S. military. I guess not just American troops. We had established U.S. Air Force at this point in time. At the height of the Korean War, there were over 3 million in the U.S. military. In the aftermath of the Korean War, it goes down. It still won't be any fewer than 2.5 million. That's a far cry from what it had been back in the, early 30s. Okay. So still pretty significant military, but when you look at the threats and how the U.S. was really becoming overextended around the world with bases, with the threats in Western Europe, for example, there in the 50s, there was the decision that there needed to be a bit of a buildup. We talked about the new look under Eisenhower, which is going to really make the decision, and this is going to be the phrase, national security at a reasonable cost. That reasonable cost is going to be a downplay of ground forces and a buildup of really serious air forces, okay, and the establishment of what becomes Strategic Air Command, and the continued just buildup on a massive level of nuclear weapons, okay? So that's kind of where we had ended last on Tuesday here. So moving from there, we had mentioned, and in your reading, it talked about really some of these ideas of nuclear war and then nuclear strategy really within this era. And we have the first guy here, Herman Kahn, and we're going to, on your study guide, and then another guy named Bernard Brody. And there's several of these thinkers, but these are the two pretty heavy hitters. And I listed them because they really are kind of diametrically opposed. They both definitely figure in that nuclear weapons have a place in strategy. That's the reality of the world that they live in, that we all live in, like it or not, and we still continue to live in today. But to go along with that, they view that they have different places in their strategy. Herman Kahn, and I'm not making this up, a number of people called him the nuclear Santa Claus. Herman Kahn let's just say he was a little bit big boned, but one of his phrases was this idea of thinking the unthinkable. He challenged really these strategists, politicians, generals, and others that in his mind they couldn't be soft or they couldn't be timid. He argued that there might be scenarios in which nuclear weapons, it would be appropriate to use them, that they were controllable. So this idea of thinking the unthinkable, that yes, nuclear weapons would kill millions, but you had to be in a position to use them, that was part of a deterrent, but you couldn't think of them simply as a deterrent, that if you viewed them only as a deterrent, it wouldn't be a deterrent, okay? He wrote a book, and there's a certain bit of irony, but he's doing it deliberately. He took a page out of our friend Karl von Clausewitz. He wrote a book called On Thermonuclear War, okay? And in that book and other writings on his part, he had a 44-step escalation ladder, which is kind of dictating from kind of no crisis, and at the other end of this ladder, where it is the nuclear bombs are flying back and forth, essentially it's a spasm. All the command structure has been destroyed. The bombs are raining down. In an uncontrolled fashion, everything's being wiped out. And so it's taking you step by step up a crisis ladder, kind of walking you through these different crisis points. So taking you from a theoretical and almost gaming things out. And that's really what Herman Kahn is. Extremely brilliant man, an IQ kind of borderline. I don't want to say off the charts because, IQ is a thing that's tested. He was a brilliant man that wrote on more than the nuclear war and strategy. But it's also a point where he is an academic, and guys that are in Herman, men and women, and at this point in time, it was men, they wrote from a very academic, a scholarly position with virtually no combat experience, no diplomatic experience. It is think tank experience, okay? Gaming, war gaming. And that's going to be a criticism. Okay, so when we're saying, we'll get back to that in a moment. So this think the unthinkable, nuclear wars are not necessarily unwinnable. We have the idea that, from what we would call probably a rational point of view, how can we call something winnable when on the winning side, you might have 10, 20, 50 million people being killed, in the United States from an exchange with another country. Is that really victory? Okay. But he's saying that could be a win. Okay. Because you wipe out the other side. Would make arguments that efforts to prevent these might be reactionary. If you wipe out any potential threat for down the road, where you eliminate all opposition, an attempt to do so would be reactionary. So terms like kill ratio and response mapping and target priorities, these kinds of gaming terms, he's doing that. We saw a map earlier in the semester that had a map of the United States. It was from the Soviet Union, but we had similar things for the Soviets and for other countries showing the priorities of the places that we would be hitting. Okay, so we had that final idea. We already went through scenarios in which the use of nuclear weapons might be appropriate and controllable. Okay, where things might escalate this city and then you hit that city back and forth until somebody hits an ouch point and they give up. Okay, now you contrast that with the flip side, Bernard Brodie, who's also a nuclear strategist and wrote some pretty brilliant books, and he's arguing that preventative nuclear strikes would lead to escalation from limited to total war. He's concluding deterrence through second strike capability, so we'll get to what that means in a second, would lead to a more secure outcome for both sides. So this idea that both sides were I gotta go here. I'm still here. Yes, I'm on the call. Both sides we're building by the time we're in the 50s and approaching the 60s. Now we're at hundreds of nuclear weapons. And then we're going to begin approaching in the thousands of nuclear weapons. And throughout the 60s and into the 70s, now we're in the thousands. Okay. So you have a first strike capability where an all out, you launch the nukes and you can take out every city on the other side, every major city, not just with one nuke, but with multiple nukes. And even if you lose bombers with some of those weapons going into the other side, and eventually when you have the missiles that can be launched from fields and from bases around your country, or from silos, some of those get taken out, but you still have enough redundancy where you can still take out cities on the other side. You still have enough redundancy in those strikes to take out those other places. You can still, in that first strike, take out the other side. A second strike capability, okay, a first strike would be arguing we can hit the other side so hard that they can't hit us back. So there's a temptation with the first strike to take out the other side so hard that they can't hit you back. So it's almost a preemptive strike. Okay. You can win before the other side. You can hit them so hard you can win that they can't hit you back. So there's a temptation to use the nukes quickly. Okay. If you have a second strike capability that's out of reach of your enemy, an example of that would be perhaps submarines, okay, that are underwater, not detectable, okay, or hard to detect, hard to reach, that could come to the surface or near the surface and launch them after a strike has been detected. Or you have mobile launchers moving by train, or in some sort of a mobile launcher that can go through difficult terrain and be at random locations, which both sides had that kind of capability. Train was something that happened quite a bit too, moving around the country. Hardened locations, concrete silos. So again, or like the United States, we had these in fields across the Midwest, like we saw again in the picture that we saw earlier. Where you just was going to be, how do you take all of those sites out, okay, across the country accurately without getting hit back? Okay, so by having a second strike capability, now that's a deterrent. Because even if you do a first strike that takes out the bulk of the other side, you still get hit hard enough that you're going to get punished. Okay, so this is what Brody's arguing. So now this line I've got in bold. Thus far, the chief purpose of our military establishment has been to win wars. But from now on, its chief purpose must be to avert them. So to stop them from happening. It can have almost no other useful purpose. Now, this part of Brody, you could argue, and it was argued as a criticism of him, as being maybe naive. Okay. His point is a general war between the US and the Soviets, for example, or a general war between the U.S. and the Communist Chinese once they have nuclear weapons. That's his point. If a general war emerges between them, it's disastrous, because how are you going to stop it from eventually reaching the use of some nuclear weapons? Okay. By saying it this generally, his critics were saying he's arguing war needs to stop. And wars didn't stop. We know that wars have continued from 1950 on. But if we stop and think about it, the scale of general war, of the scope and the how massive, you think about the level of casualties, of deaths, okay, the scale has been more limited, okay. That doesn't limit. We still have had entirely too much, and we've had terrible loss, okay. But if you stop and think about it compared to a World War I and a World War II, and you think about how much the population of the world has grown during post-World War II times, warfare has decreased. If you think about it in those terms, if you put it in scale of the population growth as well. But Brody's comment here is kind of a fair one. And his criticism is, this idea of Khan, these war games and the danger of this fog of war, of these misunderstandings, of talking about, hey, there's scenarios where nuclear weapons could be controlled, the use of them, this tit for tat, okay, where you could win it. He's like, that is dangerous to approach conflict that way, how quickly war can get out of control. And Herman Kahn, Nuclear Santa Claus, all that stuff, he is arguing, Brody and others, that they're too timid with that. Okay. And you had generals and politicians on both sides that subscribe to these things, but a lot on the Herman Kahn side were very academic, and they didn't tend to have a lot of that combat and diplomatic experience on that side. Okay, so there we go with those two. Now, Dulles and Eisenhower, we talked about the new look already, but terms like massive retaliation, the threat of these hundreds and eventually thousands of nuclear weapons, the idea of brinkmanship. Okay, so the massive retaliation, the threat of that force, brinkmanship, the not blinking, playing chicken with the other side. Okay, going right to the brink of war. Think about things like, eventually, this isn't Eisenhower, but going to the brink over the Cuban Missile Crisis, that's brinkmanship. Okay, the threat of nuclear war, almost getting there. Okay, those are those terms there. We're in a dangerous era of diplomacy. Okay, you think about the nuclear triad, and then the nuclear triad, and then SAC, Supreme Air Command. I'm sorry, the Strategic Air Command, and then you've got the image there to go along with it. The nuclear triad, you've got the Strategic Air Command, you've got in the triad, you've got bombers. Okay, so think about the big bombers that can carry the nuclear weapons. Okay, and they would be dropping them. Think like the one Enola Gay and others that dropped them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You've got submarine force, the submarine force that could be that second strike capability. Okay, so underwater, that kind of a thing. And then eventually, when you had the ICBM, the missile force, the intercontinental ballistic missiles. Okay, the kind that can be launched from Kansas or something like that, and could hit Moscow. Okay, so that's kind of three-pronged missile force. Okay, nuclear force. Okay, you had the establishment post World War II, the establishment of the Central Intelligence Agency, just kind of the reality in the Cold War of the Central Intelligence Agency to initially be an unbiased kind of analysis, a clearinghouse for intelligence, gathering of foreign intelligence, but also to establish covert operations, dealing with enemies of the United States, by the actual action of the legislation that established the Central Intelligence Agency, not supposed to operate directly on American soil. You have a headquarters in Langley in Virginia, but operates outside the United States. The kind of intelligence within the United States would be the FBI, but the CIA overseas. So the CIA gathered intelligence. They had covert operations in places like Guatemala, Honduras, Iran, behind the Iron Curtain, that kind of thing. Eventually, you have things like the NSA, the National Security Agency, is developed, these kinds of things, but the CIA plays a major role in this. And then, the military and others, this is a part of the huge apparatus that forms for this during the Cold War and beyond. So now we have thinking about, we're going to focus on a few things with Vietnam, but you've got here a map of Southeast Asia. This is after the French have been booted out of Southeast Asia. Just again, the Tonkin Gulf incident you should look at within your reading, that incident that helps nudge the United States further toward conflict. We had advisors there by that point in time, and it had advisors there for years from Eisenhower on, okay, and into Kennedy. And at this point, it's another president. You had Johnson. But in this incident here, that lead to the first strikes. But the thing that we're going to be talking about here with that, the Tonkin Gulf incident leads to the Tonkin Gulf resolution, which gives Johnson from Congress an overwhelming vote. Congress votes to give Johnson full discretion, full power to protect American strategic and security interests in Southeast Asia. So, including with our allies. So he's able to essentially wage war. It's not a declared war, but he has the power to do what's needed to protect American interests, American lives, American security in Southeast Asia. He's going to describe the Tonkin Gulf resolution as kind of a blank check. It's like, he actually describes it as grandma's nightshirt. It covers everything. Now, we don't necessarily need that imagery, okay, of grandma in her nightshirt, but the idea that it does cover everything, okay? He's going to be in a position, he's asked, this is the summer of 1964. Remember, 1964 will be a presidential election year. And he's asked by the press, does this mean that we're going to war in Southeast Asia? We launched bombing missions in the aftermath of that initial attack on a destroyer in the Tonkin Gulf, but then the second attack, which doesn't happen, we initially think maybe it does, but it doesn't. But in the aftermath of that second imagined incident, we launch airstrikes on North Vietnam, retaliatory strikes, and we have the first American, prisoner that's taken from a plane that's shot down, Everett Alvarez. He reassures the press and public in a press conference, we don't want our American boys to do the fighting for Asian boys. We don't want to get involved in a nation with 700 million people, get tied down in a land war in Asia. Well, that may be a shout out to the Princess Bride. Okay. 700 don't get in a land war in Asia. He's not talking about Vietnam with the 700 million people. That'd be China, which directly, borders, as we look at that initial image here. Communist China is to the north of North Vietnam, directly bordering it. He's saying we're not sending American combat troops there. We have advisors there training the South Vietnamese army, our ally, but we're sending more and more advisors. Okay, when Kennedy was killed in 1963, we had ballpark somewhere around 20 or so thousand American advisors in Vietnam, with more in the pipeline. Okay. That had continued to go up. 1964, he's facing, AUH2O, that's Barry Goldwater, a conservative Republican that's calling Johnson soft on communism. He wins a massive victory at the polls. He's going to beat Goldwater pretty badly. Okay. He makes this statement about not going there with American boys, but in March of 1965, American combat troops do indeed go. The first 3,500 or so American combat troops, so the American Marines, 3,500 or so American Marines in March 1965 go and land in Vietnam. Still no declaration of war, okay? And we never have a declaration of war in Vietnam. It's termed of kind of a police action similar to Korea. But you're going to have, in this case, 58,000+ Americans are going to die in this conflict. Okay. And this kind of calls into action a few things, and one critical piece that we need to consider. Johnson, while with his advisors, and these are the advisors, what was termed the best and the brightest, okay, the advisors that Kennedy had, okay, the Ivy League educated advisors, okay, they had deemed that we needed to take a gradual escalation approach, this limited war approach, okay. They decided not to call up the reserves, okay. We're going to limit the risks in Southeast Asia. We need to maintain our commitment in Western Europe and all around the world. We need to contain these risks. We don't want to allow the Soviet Union to take advantage elsewhere around the world. So we're going to limit our risks while we're slowly escalating, and we're trying to apply pressure on North Vietnam and try to get them to cry uncle. We're trying to win in South Vietnam at the minimal cost. Okay. So we don't call up the reserves. We don't call up the military reserves. We don't call up the National Guard. And it's going to be a lightning rod eventually for criticism down the road. We're doing this. It's part of it's political, but war is political. And it's so generals and others can be critical about this. But part of it is understanding that all of these decisions are political in nature. Johnson is trying to decide what will the public support. And in 1964 and 65, the public would have been more understanding about these decisions, especially if you're open and you're honest. Think back to the presentation about post-Vietnam and the Weinberger and Powell doctrines, that thing about being honest with the public and getting them on your side. You got to be honest to do those things and make your case. We never truly made that case except communism is a threat. Okay. We also made this decision. We didn't call up the reserves because we were worried about, would that be popular to be calling up these reserves? The other thing is that when we're doing the draft, and you got to remember the draft, we had a peacetime draft, post World War II. And those drafts were typically, roughly 2 years. We made the decision for those going to Vietnam that they were going to be 1-year terms of enlistments. The Marines were always a little bit longer. They typically were 13 months. But the decision to have 1-year terms of enlistment, okay, and that was to kind of spread things out. Now that it's to spread things out, make it a little more equitable, but that has consequences too, okay, because, think about World War II, you're drafted or you volunteer, you're in it, okay, you're in the war. Until the end of the conflict, okay? And you're in that war, you get trained, you go and fight. The longer you're in it, the more experienced that you are. Those officers and those military, the personnel, whether they're Marines, whether they're soldiers, whether they're in the Navy, they get more proficient. And the more proficient you get, the more experience you get, the higher survival that you get. And it's not just you as an individual, but the officers that you have. You have a higher survival rate as a new person coming into a unit if you have experienced NCOs, your sergeants and that kind of thing, and the more experienced officers that you have, you have that correlation is there. But by constantly rotating in new personnel, and that includes officers as well, that's going to have some problems with the efficiency, the effectiveness of your units. Okay. But it was the idea that politically, and the will and the morale of the home front, that this is what would be supported, that families could handle the deployment for a 1-year tour of their loved ones, their sons, their brothers, their fathers, their husbands, a little bit easier than an open-ended 2 or 3 or 4 year deployment. Okay. Something else to keep in mind with that, I'm actually gonna think about, I'm gonna skip over that to this here piece. I'll go back to that other one, but you think about this one here as far as a draft and selective service, and this image here about being ordered to report for your physical exam, this person here being drafted. This is in 61 during the peacetime draft. Okay, they're in Waukegan, Illinois. But you think about from 64 to 72, there were nearly 27 million eligible American men that were eligible to be drafted. And we think about the draft during Vietnam, and I can't really ask the class or ask questions and prompting questions and prodding, that kind of thing. But, I think it might be surprising that you have nearly 4 times the number of people volunteer during that time as are drafted. Nearly 8.8 million men volunteer during the Vietnam conflict. 2.2 million are drafted. 15.9 million escape the system. Now, by escaping the system, that doesn't mean that you do anything underhanded. You can escape the system by being in college, by being in the National Guard. For example, President Bush, George W. Bush, he was in the National Guard. He served. He didn't go to Vietnam. Okay. By being in college, you had a draft exemption. Okay, that eventually was pulled because that was deemed to be correctly, probably okay, that it wasn't equitable for those that they couldn't afford to be in college. Okay, that eventually was. You could have a doctor's note, and quite often those with a decent relationship with their doctor, or a doctor that was not in favor of the Vietnam War, would be pretty generous with those doctor's notes. This person has some sort of a medical concern. Okay. Um, doctors note, I mentioned um, that we've had presidential candidates, we've had presidents, okay, with doctor's notes. We've said college exempt industries, somebody that worked, with port facilities, for example, railroad industries, key industries, you could have an exemption. All of this is legal, okay? You could be in the draft, but then you didn't get called for the draft, okay? What they're doing in this picture are they're creating that new draft calendar by pulling out the kind of ping pong balls, okay? And so your number just might be called up, okay? So nearly 16 million escaped that system in that way. But you could volunteer. And, again, one of the articles that you read for for Vietnam 67 was being drafted. And so he kind of talked through how he went through that and things he was looking at and trying. Okay. And things he was looking at volunteering, but eventually he was drafted. 209,000 people were called draft dodgers, people that were drafted but fled or avoided the draft. That was illegal. Okay, fleeing to Canada, fleeing to Britain, fleeing the country, or going underground, living in the United States, but going underground, just not cooperating with it. There was not like some major secret police kind of a thing. The FBI and some other agencies were doing a soft look for those people, but typically when those people got picked up, it's because they got arrested for something else. There wasn't like a major manhunt. It was if they kind of reared their head doing something. If they were doing a major protest or something along those lines, is when they got picked up. Okay, so there we go with those two slides. I'm going to stop this one here, post it, and then we'll come back to the other slide. Okay, so I'm going to do this one.